At my daughter's lavish birthday party in front of 150 wealthy guests, she suddenly slapped me so hard the entire room fell silent. My hand-carved gift box slipped from my fingers and shattered across the marble floor, but she didn't even look at it. Instead, she called me trash. My son-in-law calmly threw a glass of red wine onto my chest, and security dragged me out of the mansion I once sacrificed everything to help them build. As the heavy doors slammed behind me and the rain poured down, I realized something chilling. The people celebrating inside had no idea whose life had truly paid for their luxury. 70 years old, penniless, surrounded by a crowd whose entire world of privilege had been purchased with my suffering, and not a single one of them understood that. To every person in that ballroom, I was simply a shabby old man in a worn suit who had embarrassed himself and spoiled the evening. The guards moved without a moment's pause. 2 sets of hands seized my arms and steered me across the floor. My old shoes dragged over that gleaming stone, the very marble I had once written the check to lay. They gave me no chance to speak. A hard shove sent me stumbling through the great oak doors, and I went down the broad front steps in a half-fall landing on the driveway, with enough force to drive the gravel into my knees. Pain crackled up both legs like an electric current. The doors swallowed the party whole behind me, one thunderous slam, and the warmth, the laughter, the music all vanished. San Francisco nights can be punishing, and this one was. The rain arrived almost immediately. Not a drizzle but a downpour, drops hammering the asphalt as though the sky itself was angry. The wine already soaking my shirt merged with the water and trickled down my jacket in long, pale red rivulets, thin as watered-down blood. I stayed down, couldn't bring myself to move. Sitting on that wet pavement, I tilted my head back and looked up at the mansion's lit windows. Inside, the glass silhouettes drifted past figures lifting crystal, laughing, swaying beneath chandelier light and quiet music. Every one of them was toasting a fortune I had handed them. My fingers trembled against the cold asphalt as the rain worked its way through every layer I had on. This is where it ends, I told myself. This is where my story closes. I might die right here on the driveway of a house that was in ways none of them knew still mine. Getting upright took everything I had. Each joint fired a separate complaint as I straightened. The rain had matted my gray hair flat to my skull, and water ran down my cheeks the way tears would have if I'd had any left. I put my back to the glowing facade and walked one slow step at a time down the long, curving driveway toward the gate. Behind me, the $15 million estate lit up the night, like something out of a dream, radiant and utterly unreachable. Wind found every gap in my soaked jacket and pushed through without mercy. No destination ahead of me, not a dollar to my name, no one anywhere left to phone. Welcome back to His Hidden Revenge, the place where the stories that hurt the most are the ones that end in justice. If these stories find something real inside you, I'd be grateful if you'd like this one and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. And before we go any further, tell me in the comments, what is the weather like where you are right now? It is storming here as I tell this, and somehow that feels exactly right for a night like the one I lived through. A note before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is entirely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. Each step felt heavier than the one before. I moved down the dark road with rain blurring everything around me, my breath rising in slow, pale clouds against the freezing air. Minutes passed, maybe more. In that darkness, they felt like hours. The only sounds were the rain against the pavement and the far-off murmur of the city tucked below the hills. Then the darkness shattered. A pair of blinding headlights blazed through the storm at my back. The engine's growl reached me first, deep, expensive, unmistakably powerful. Tires screamed on the slick road as a long, midnight black Rolls-Royce Ghost shot forward and swung sideways, cutting off the road ahead of me. My heart seized. For a fraction of a second, I was certain Derek had dispatched someone to deepen the humiliation to haul me somewhere even darker. The Ghost's heavy rear door swung open. A man emerged into the downpour. His suit was dark and cut with the kind of precision that cost more than anything I had ever owned. He carried a large charcoal umbrella in one hand, holding it against the storm. Late 40s tall, composed, his sharp eyes cold and calculating as they swept over me through the curtain of rain. I had never laid eyes on him before. He came closer, the umbrella throwing a shadow across his face. His gaze traveled from my soaked clothing to the wine stains on my chest, then to my trembling hands. He stopped a few feet away. "Get in the car. Mr. Pruitt?" He said, his voice quiet, but weighted with the kind of authority that doesn't ask twice. "It's time we crush them." I stood motionless in the freezing rain, those words ringing through me. Crush them. The phrase pushed back against the roar of the storm and refused to dissolve. Barely 10 minutes ago, my own daughter had struck me across the face and called me garbage in front of the wealthiest people in the city. My son-in-law had doused my chest with wine and had me thrown out like a broken piece of furniture. And now, a stranger stepping out of a Rolls-Royce was offering me something I hadn't the words to name yet. My worn-out mind struggled to process it. I felt hollowed out, shattered, ready to accept whatever grim fate the dark streets of Atherton had waiting for me. And yet, here was this man carrying himself with the measured calm of someone accustomed to enormous power, planting himself in front of me and offering a way to fight back. I hesitated. 70 hard years had taught me to be careful. Men like this don't step out of the rain to rescue strangers off the roadside, and you don't climb into a midnight black Rolls-Royce with someone you've never met, not in a place like Atherton, where fortunes are assembled in daylight and buried secrets thrive after dark. I read his face. His jaw was set and controlled. His dark eyes held no warmth, no pity. Only calculation, cold and exact. Strangely, that was what persuaded me. I had endured enough pity to last several lifetimes. For 5 grinding years I had swallowed it, living in Derek's damp basement. The sidelong glances, the dismissive sighs, the politely worded sympathies about how unfortunate my circumstances were. I was done with pity. I wanted justice. Or maybe standing there soaked to the bone, what I really wanted was something rawer than that revenge. I stepped toward the car without a word. The stranger widened the door and angled the umbrella so the rain cleared my head as I bent inside. The contrast hit me like a physical force. The cabin smelled of polished walnut and hand-stitched leather. Warm air closed around me and began pulling the deep cold out of my bones. I sat there for a moment, barely able to take it in. The instant my soaked legs cleared the door, the man pulled it shut with a solid, reassuring thud. The storm's fury cut off completely. Inside, the silence was absolute, dense and insulated, like the interior of a vault. A moment later, he settled in from the opposite door, folding his charcoal umbrella with unhurried precision. Beyond the dark-tinted partition, the driver engaged the gears without a word. The ghost glided forward. Through the rear window, I watched the blazing lights of the $15 million mansion dissolve into the rain. My daughter's mansion, or, as I would come to understand, not entirely hers. I sat stiffly in the immaculate seat, acutely aware of what I looked like. My cheap suit was waterlogged and wine-stained, the fabric pressing its ruin into the cream leather beneath me. I felt like a muddy boot left on a gallery floor. The stranger betrayed no reaction. He leaned toward the center console, opened a concealed compartment in the polished walnut panel, and produced a thick, warmed cashmere cloth. He passed it to me, then lifted a crystal decanter and poured a measure of amber into a heavy tumbler. "Drink," he said simply. "It will stop the shaking." My hands were still unsteady as I took the cloth and pressed it to my face, feeling the warmth move into my skin. Then I accepted the glass and brought it carefully to my lips. The bourbon burned warmly down my throat, spreading heat through my chest like a quiet, controlled fire. For the first time since the slap, I could draw a full breath. I steadied myself and found my voice. "Who are you?" I asked. My voice sounded hoarse and fragile to my own ears. "And why would someone like you stop for a worthless old man on the side of the road?" He adjusted the cuffs of his suit with a precise tug. Platinum cufflinks flashed briefly in the warm cabin light. Then his eyes came to mine, steady and unsettlingly calm. "My name is Elliot Crane," he said, "and you are far from worthless, Leonard. At this moment, you may be the most important man in San Francisco. You simply don't know it yet." I stared at him. He knew my name, my full name. A sharp ripple of unease moved through me. Was he a detective, a private investigator, or worse, one of Derek's corporate rivals looking to use me as leverage? "How do you know who I am?" I asked, sitting slightly straighter, grasping at whatever shred of dignity remained. "I've never seen you before in my life. I'm a retired mechanic from Cleveland. No money, no influence. My own daughter had me removed from her house tonight." I paused and took another small pull from the glass. "If this is some kind of scheme, I continued, the bitterness edging into my voice. You've picked the wrong man. They wouldn't spend $1 to get me back. Elliot allowed a faint smile. There was nothing warm in it. He settled back and folded his hands in his lap. I know precisely what happened inside that house tonight, Leonard, he said. I know about the wooden box you carved. I know your daughter struck you. I know Derek poured wine on your jacket. And I know security walked you out the front door like an unwanted stray. My stomach dropped. This man knew far too much. I've had my eye on your son-in-law for quite some time. A chill moved down my spine, one that had nothing to do with wet clothes. Elliot spoke with the quiet certainty of a man who holds powerful information and knows exactly what it's worth. You've been watching Derek, I said slowly. Why? I hesitated. Are you with the police? Elliot's smile returned colder this time, and somehow worse. He reached to the console and lifted a silver tablet resting beside the decanter. Open this. He placed the device in my hands. My fingers were still slightly unsteady as I took it. The screen was already lit. Rows of financial records filled the display, bank transfers, corporate filings, legal documents, dense columns of figures. I scanned the screen and understood none of it. I can't make sense of any of this, I said quietly. I'm a mechanic. I work on engines. I don't read corporate balance sheets. Elliot leaned forward, elbows on his knees, gaze sharpening, like a man who has just located exactly what he came looking for. I am the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, he said. We're a private equity firm headquartered in Chicago. Our specialty is aggressive acquisitions. We move in on, companies dismantle their structures, liquidate the assets, and expose whatever debts their owners have tried to bury. He let that settle for a beat. In plain language, Leonard, we destroy corporations that are built on lies. My grip tightened on the tablet. His voice never wavered. And your son-in-law's empire, he continued, is one of the most compelling lies we have come across in years. I swallowed. The bourbon suddenly sat heavy in my stomach. Why would a Wall Street billionaire concern himself with a retired mechanic from Cleveland? I asked, completely at a loss. Elliot didn't answer right away. He turned toward the rain-streaked window for a moment, watching the water slide down the dark glass before bringing his gaze back to me. Because of what's on that tablet, Leonard, he said quietly. 5 years ago, Derek Voss was a desperate man. His first 2 startups had both collapsed. Investors had cleared out. He was drowning in debt and staring down the barrel of personal bankruptcy. More than anything, he was terrified that your daughter would walk the moment the money vanished. The words hit something deep and old inside me. I closed my eyes without meaning to. The memories came flooding back with a clarity that hurt. Elliot was right. I could still see that night in Cleveland as though it had happened last week, a freezing evening in late November. Derek had shown up unannounced at my modest little house, small place peeling paint garage off to the side mine for decades. He sat down at my old kitchen table, the one gouged with years of tool marks and grease from repair manuals. Then he dropped his face into his hands and broke down. Not a polite, restrained kind of crying. He wept like a man who had hit a wall he couldn't see past. He laid it all out for me. The companies were gone. His credit was in ruins. Every investor had walked away. Without capital, immediately his career was finished. I just need one last chance, he had said through his tears. One more round of funding and this real estate tech platform takes off. I know it will. But there was a condition. He begged me not to breathe a word to Celeste. The humiliation in his voice was raw when he explained it. His pride couldn't survive Celeste knowing that her working-class father had pulled him back from the edge. She believed he was a self-made man, brilliant and untouched by failure, and he needed that story to hold. If she finds out you bailed me out, he'd said, she'll never see me the same way again. And I, blinded completely by love, agreed. I loved my daughter more than I had words for. I wanted her marriage to last. I wanted her to be happy. So I did what fathers do. I gave up everything. I went to the bank and drained my retirement account. I sold the auto repair shop I had spent 40 years building from scratch. That garage had been the work of my entire life. Every tool, every loyal customer, every hard-earned memory, gone. When it was all settled, I had exactly $500,000. Every cent I had in the world. I handed it to him. But because Derek insisted that the money stay hidden from Celeste, his lawyers constructed a blind trust. The funds were moved into a corporate structure specifically designed to keep my name off every official record. I signed without a second's hesitation. I wasn't making an investment. I was saving my daughter's marriage, and in doing so, I had handed over my entire life to protect Derek Voss's fragile ego. Elliot watched my face as the memories resurfaced, his eyes cataloging each flicker of grief and regret. "You placed everything you owned inside a blind trust," he said, his voice level. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. You surrendered your home, your retirement, your financial security to shield the pride of the man who had you thrown out into the rain tonight. I dropped my gaze. "Yes," I said. The word came out cracked at the edges, weighted with years of quiet shame. "I thought I was protecting my family." I stared down at my worn shoes against the spotless ghost's floor mat. But it didn't work out that way. My throat constricted as I repeated the version of events I had carried for 5 years. "The market turned," I said slowly. "Derek came to me a few months later, looking absolutely shattered. He told me the startup market had collapsed. He told me every dollar he had invested my money had vanished overnight." I swallowed against the tightness in my throat. He said the entire $500,000 was gone. Even now the words tasted bitter. Lost. I pulled in a shaky breath. "He said he felt terrible," I went on quietly. "But he told me another group of investors had stepped in at the last minute and saved the company. My money was gone, but at least the business survived." I let a beat pass. "That's how I ended up in their basement." The admission sat heavily in the car. "Derek said I could stay as an act of kindness," I continued. "He said he felt responsible for what had happened to me. I had no house, no business, no retirement." I let out a short, hollow laugh. "So he gave me a small room next to the furnace, and I took it because I believed him. I believed I had destroyed my own future. I thought he was doing me a favor." I whispered, letting a foolish old man stay under his roof. Silence settled over the ghost. The engine hummed beneath us while rain ticked steadily against the windows. Elliot showed no trace of sympathy. Instead, something colder moved into his expression. He leaned forward and tapped the tablet screen in my hands. A new document opened immediately, a detailed bank statement dated exactly 5 years back. The figures blazed on the screen. For a moment, I couldn't draw breath. The numbers told an entirely different story from the one I had believed for half a decade. A crushing wave of disbelief rolled through me as I stared at the data. He didn't lose a single dollar. Leonard D. Elliot said, his voice quiet and precise as a blade moving through the cabin's silence. "He lied to you." The words echoed inside me. A lie? That couldn't be true. It simply couldn't. I had seen the documents. I had watched Derek pace my basement floor, dragging his hands through his hair, voice cracking as he described the market collapse. I had watched genuine tears roll down his face while he apologized again and again. For 5 years I had lived believing I had destroyed my own retirement, that I had bet my future on a gamble and lost every chip. My throat tightened painfully. I gripped the tablet until my knuckles paled. Elliot reached over and gently took the device from my shaking hands, replacing it with something heavier, a thick manila folder. "Open it," he said. His tone left no room for argument. I lifted the cover slowly. Inside lay dozens of printed documents, each bearing official bank seals and federal registry stamps. This wasn't speculation. This was proof. My eyes moved across the first page. It was a financial ledger from the exact month of the $500,000 transfer. According to Derek's account, that money had gone into a startup that collapsed within weeks of funding. But the document in front of me showed something completely different. A wire transfer running directly from the blind trust into a newly formed corporate holding account. The money hadn't been lost at all. It had been moved carefully, deliberately. Derek had used my life savings as the founding capital for his real estate technology company. My hands shook as I turned to the next page, and the next, and the one after that. Each document mapped the company's explosive growth over the 5 years that followed. There were no other early investors. No venture capitalists had arrived at the 11th hour to rescue the business. There was only one source of capital, mine. Every office, every server, every luxury car, every mansion had been built on my $500,000. The realization arrived like something enormous traveling at full speed. Derek hadn't let me live in that basement out of kindness. He kept me there because it was the most efficient way to control me, to keep me isolated, impoverished, ashamed, and ignorant. Had I stayed in Cleveland, I might have started asking questions. But By keeping me under his roof, stripping away my dignity piece by piece, and feeding me a steady diet of reminders about my supposed failure, he made sure I would never go looking for the truth. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. For 5 years I had eaten his leftovers. I had worn the same fading clothes until they nearly fell apart. I had apologized to him for taking up space in his home. All while he crossed continents on private jets, drank rare vintage wines, and purchased Celeste a $15 million mansion with money that was mine. Something deep and old inside me began to shift. A quiet anger climbed slowly out of the floor of my chest. Not explosive, colder than that, sharper, a controlled fury that burned away every last shred of sorrow and self-pity. For the first time in years, my mind felt clear and still. I raised my head and looked directly at Elliot. My eyes were steady. "So, he stole it," I said slowly. My voice came out calm, far calmer than anything I felt inside, and strangely foreign to my own ears. "He took my money, built an empire on it, and then legally erased me from the picture entirely." Elliot shook his head. A faint predatory smile settled at the corners of his mouth, the kind a hunter wears when he realizes the trap has already closed. "That," Elliot said smoothly, "is actually the most beautiful part of this entire situation." Leonard the Friender frowned, confused. "Derek Voss is an extraordinarily arrogant man," Elliot continued. "But arrogance and intelligence are two very different things. When he persuaded you to establish the blind trust 5 years ago, he made a critical error. He tried to cut corners." Elliot leaned forward slightly, a trace of amusement shading his tone. Rather than engaging a top-tier legal firm to draft a custom trust agreement, he pulled a standard template off the shelf, something cheap, generic, and broadly available. He believed he was being clever. In reality, he had simply put his own ignorance on display. He tapped a finger against the folder resting in my lap. "You see, Derek was so consumed with keeping your involvement concealed from Celeste that he failed to understand how the trust structure actually worked." Elliot paused, then went on. "He appointed himself the managing director of the trust. That gave him full operational control over the funds, the ability to move money, invest it, build companies with it, whatever he chose." Elliot's smile grew sharper. "But operational control is not the same as ownership." He reached across and flipped the dossier open to its final page. His finger came to rest on a dense clause buried near the bottom of the document. "Read this," he said. I leaned in, trying to work through the legal language on the page. The text was dense with specialized terminology writing, built for lawyers, not for mechanics. Elliot spoke again, translating it calmly. "When the trust was established, you were named the sole primary equity holder. That means the original investment, your $500,000, belonged entirely to you. Derek was never granted ownership, only management." Elliot tapped the paragraph again. "And because that $500,000 was the only capital used to incorporate the holding company that later became Derek's empire, your equity stake carried forward into every corporate structure that followed." My mind strained to keep pace. Elliot's voice stayed even. "In plain terms," he said, "your ownership percentage grew right alongside the company. As the business expanded, so did your equity." He settled back into the ghost's leather seat. "You were never bought out. Derek never had the personal capital to purchase your shares. Which means, legally speaking," Elliot let the sentence breathe for a moment, "you still hold the majority." I looked at him without comprehension. The words rang in my ears but wouldn't quite land. "I'm not sure I'm following you," I said quietly, though something deep and formless was beginning to take shape inside me, something vast and terrifying. "What does that actually mean for me?" Elliot turned his head slightly and gestured toward the rain-blurred window. Through the glass, I could still make out the distant glow of the Atherton mansion we had left behind, its lights shimmering through the storm like a palace suspended above the dark hillside. Elliot pointed toward it. "It means," he said quietly, "that legally speaking, Mr. Pruitt, you own 80% of everything. The air left my lungs, the company, the corporate accounts, the investment portfolios." His fingers shifted slightly still, aimed at the distant lights. "That house, the very mansion they had just thrown you out of," the words hit me like a hammer blow. 80%. I owned 80% of a multi-million-dollar empire. For several seconds I couldn't produce a sound. My thoughts scrambled to absorb the revelation. The damp basement room where I had been sleeping, the worn clothes I had on, The leftover food I ate alone downstairs, while the house entertained guests above me. All of it had been a lie. Derek wasn't my benefactor, I was his, and he had repaid that sacrifice by turning me into a phantom inside my own investment. I looked down at the thick folder in my lap. Its weight suddenly felt enormous. I began turning the pages carefully. Elliot had flagged dozens of documents, corporate structures, tax filings, financial transfers, each one tracing the growth of Derek's company step by step. My money had been the foundation. Every office building, every development project, every luxury purchase, all of it raised on that original $500,000. A deep rolling wave of betrayal moved through me. I kept turning pages slowly. Then something near the back of the folder stopped me. A single sheet that looked nothing like the others. Where the financial reports and legal filings were dense and complicated, this document was short, unnervingly straightforward. I eased it out of the stack. The paper was crisp, official, a legal waiver. My hands trembled slightly as I brought it up toward the warm cabin light and began to read. Each sentence drew the knot in my chest tighter. It was a complete equity waiver, an unconditional transfer of ownership. The document stated that the primary shareholder, me, voluntarily surrendered all equity rights in the trust and transferred them in full to Derek Voss. All 80%. My breathing slowed. My eyes drifted to the bottom of the page, and there it was, my signature, clear, undeniable, not forged, not fabricated. My handwriting, my pen, my name. The air inside the ghost suddenly felt thin. For several seconds I sat perfectly still, staring at the page while my heart hammered against my ribs. When had I signed this? The question circled through my mind without stopping. I dug back through my memory, every meeting, every document, every pen stroke. Then it hit me, sharp and sudden, like something driven straight into my chest. About a month earlier, Derek had come down to the basement, carrying a thick sheaf of paperwork under his arm. I can see it now with painful clarity, every detail returning at once. He had been unusually pleasant that day. He had even brought me a hot cup of coffee, which he almost never did. His voice carried that breezy, faintly impatient tone people use when dealing with bureaucratic nuisance. He told me the company's health insurance provider needed updated medical history forms for everyone listed as a dependent at the property, a routine compliance review apparently, and he needed signatures from anyone living under his roof. Just pointless paperwork, he muttered, shaking his head. Insurance companies love wasting people's time. He moved through the stack, quickly tapping the bottom of each page and telling me exactly where to sign. I didn't question it. Why would I? Derek had been managing every financial matter in the household for years. As far as I was concerned, he was the successful businessman who had generously let me stay in his home after my own foolish decisions had wiped out my retirement. I trusted him. I didn't bother reading the fine print. My eyesight had been declining, and the text on those forms was small and dense. It seemed far simpler to do what he asked. So I signed page after page, believing every stroke of my pen was helping my son-in-law deal with routine insurance administration. Now, sitting inside the hushed luxury of the ghost, I understood what I had actually done. Derek had slipped the equity waiver into the middle of that stack of medical forms, hidden deliberately buried between ordinary documents where I would never think to question it. He had turned my trust into a tool against me. He knew my vision was going. He knew insurance paperwork would never raise my suspicions. And he knew that after 5 years living beneath his roof, I would never believe him capable of something so calculated and so cold. The sheer precision of that cruelty turned my stomach. Derek didn't merely want me out of sight in the basement. He wanted the empire that had been built on my money without my knowledge, and he had designed a way to take it legally, using my own signature, my own pen, my own hand. I stared mine at the ink scrolled across the bottom of the waiver. My name, my handwriting, my consent. A suffocating wave of humiliation broke over me. For weeks Derek had smiled at me across the kitchen table. For weeks he had thrown out small, sarcastic remarks, laughing quietly when I apologized for occupying space in his home. All while that signed waiver was already sitting somewhere in a file waiting. He had been biding his time, waiting for the clock to run out. I ran my thumb along the edge of the crisp paper, bitterness climbing the back of my throat. Across from me, Elliot watched in silence. His dark eyes tracked every shift in my expression. He offered no sympathy, no comfort, and strangely I was grateful for that. Comfort was worthless here. What I needed was clarity. I looked back at the document, my eyes settled on the date printed near my signature, and a cold current moved through me. The waiver had been signed 4 weeks ago, but the effective transfer date, the precise moment the equity ownership would legally change hands, was printed clearly at the top of the page. Midnight tonight. My eyes widened. Everything snapped into focus at once. The lavish birthday party still blazing inside the Atherton mansion wasn't simply a celebration for Celeste. It was a victory lap. Derek had assembled the city's wealthiest investors, developers, and social elite under one roof because he alone knew what was coming. By tomorrow morning, he expected to be the legal owner of everything, the company, the assets, the mansion, all of it. Having me thrown out tonight had been the final move. He no longer needed to keep up appearances. He already had my signature. As far as he was concerned, the game was finished. He needed me off the property before midnight, before the legal transfer became permanent and beyond any challenge. If I had simply walked away from that Atherton mansion tonight, found a cheap motel somewhere down the road, and tried to sleep through the pain of my daughter calling me trash by sunrise, everything would have been gone forever. Derek would win. He would keep the empire built on my sacrifice, and I would die someday as nothing more than a broke old mechanic who lost everything because he loved his family too much. I raised my head slowly. Elliot's cold gaze found mine. Something inside me shifted in that instant. The sadness that had pressed down on my chest for years simply lifted. In its place, something else arrived. Resolve, burning, and precise. I drew in a slow breath, steadying myself, as my weathered hands gripped the document. The time for blind loyalty had passed. The fury rising in me didn't muddy my thinking. If anything, it made everything sharper. For the first time in years, my head felt clear. I set the waiver carefully back inside the folder. Then I looked straight at Elliot. "I understand what he did," I said, my voice held steady. "He stole my money. He built a fortune on my sacrifice." I let a beat pass. "But that still doesn't explain you." I settled back slightly against the leather seat. "Men like you don't cruise through rainstorms, pulling old mechanics off the roadside, out of the goodness of their hearts." My eyes stayed fixed on his. "So, what's the real reason you're here?" Elliot gave a small nod, almost approving, as though he had been waiting for exactly that question. "We have no interest in your family's drama, Leonard," he said, his tone professional and detached. "We care about numbers." He rested his arm along the console between us. 6 months ago, Vanguard Holdings identified Derek Voss's company as a potential acquisition target. He continued evenly. On paper, his real estate technology empire looked exceptionally attractive, impressive profit margins, rapid market growth, a balance sheet that appeared nearly flawless. Elliot's lips curved slightly. They had been prepared to offer a very generous buyout. He paused, but before committing a single dollar, they conduct their own investigation. He tapped the folder. Their forensic accountants go through everything, every ledger, every tax return, every offshore account tied to the company. They specialize in uncovering what desperate men try to bury. Elliot poured another measure into his glass. The amber liquid turned slowly beneath the cabin lights. "Derek Voss is a gifted salesman," Elliot continued, "but a poor businessman." He raised the glass slightly. "And an even worse gambler." He took a measured sip. Their accountants had found something lodged deep inside his financials, a hole, a very large one. He looked directly at me. "Your son-in-law has been quietly draining millions out of the company. Not into investments, not into expansion." Elliot's voice took on a harder edge. "Into underground poker rooms, high-stakes tables, illegal ones." He shook his head slightly. Derek had convinced himself he could beat the odds. Elliot leaned forward. Instead, he had buried himself. My throat constricted. "How much?" I asked quietly. Elliot didn't hesitate. $10 million. The number hit me like a fist. 10 million. I struggled to take it in. "That much?" My voice tightened. "Who does he owe it to?" I hesitated. "The banks." Elliot brought the glass to his lips and took a slow sip before answering. If it were sitting on the books of legitimate banks, he could simply declare bankruptcy, restructure his assets, and start fresh. He said, his tone calm and matter-of-fact. "But that isn't the situation here, Leonard. The $10 million Derek Voss owed was not held by any respectable financial institution." Elliot watched my face carefully as he continued. "He owed it to a Russian syndicate operating out of Las Vegas. The words settled into the quiet cabin like something toxic. These are not people who send politely worded legal notices when a payment is missed, Elliot went on evenly. They are highly organized, highly dangerous men. When someone fails to pay them, they don't dispatch lawyers. He leaned back slightly, his voice dropping. They break legs, they torch houses, and sometimes people simply cease to exist. A chill moved through me. The image of Derek, the untouchable, swaggering CEO who commanded his mansion like a king, rearranged itself in my mind. He wasn't a king at all. He was a cornered animal. Elliot pressed on, unhurried. Derek's final grace period had expired that morning. The syndicate had extended more patience than they typically granted. Now they wanted their money back, and they weren't particular about how he raised it. The realization dropped into my chest like a stone. For the first time that night, something almost resembling pity for Derek flickered through me. Almost. But if he's carrying $10 million in debt, I said slowly, working through it piece by piece. How is he funding that party inside the mansion? I gestured vaguely toward the hills, where the estate still blazed behind us in the storm. That event must be running hundreds of thousands of dollars. The food, the champagne, the musicians, the security. None of that adds up if he's being hunted by criminals. Elliot's expression didn't shift. Instead, a faint glimmer of approval surfaced in his eyes. "You're starting to see it," he said quietly. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "That party is not a birthday celebration." The statement was flat. "It's a smokescreen." He let that sit for a moment. A very elaborate one. Elliot gestured in the direction of the Atherton estate. Derek had carefully assembled some of the wealthiest technology investors in California under that roof tonight. Venture capitalists, private equity, partners, startup founders, people commanding vast pools of capital. His voice stayed measured. Each one believed they were attending a glamorous social event. The real purpose of the evening was something else entirely. My stomach pulled tight. "He's pitching them something," I said. Elliot nodded. "Yes, he's offering them a significant stakes in his company." My pulse climbed. At a heavily discounted premium. Elliot's lips moved fractionally. On paper, the offer looked compelling, financial statements showing extraordinary margins and explosive growth. Elliot paused, but those financial statements were fabricated. The words struck like a hammer. He had forged them. Elliot tapped the folder on the console between us. Their forensic accountants had already confirmed it. The records Derek was presenting to investors that very evening had been carefully doctored to conceal the $10 million hole the debt owed to the syndicate. The knot in my gut wound tighter. "So he's going to take their money," I said quietly. Elliot nodded. "Exactly. He would collect their investment capital that night." His voice remained level, then immediately use those funds to settle his debt with the Russian mob. I felt ill. And after that, Elliot didn't pause. After that, those investors would discover they had purchased shares in a company drowning in concealed debt. He leaned back. They would be left holding nothing but air. The full scale of it struck me like a physical force. Derek wasn't merely betraying me. He was preparing to fleece dozens of wealthy investors in a single night and use their money to save his own life. Elliot went on measured as ever. Vanguard Holdings wanted Derek's technology. The software itself had genuine value, real potential. He paused briefly, but they would never acquire a company entangled with organized crime. His gaze sharpened. The only path to those assets was for the current structure to collapse, and that meant Derek Voss had to be removed. The words settled heavily between us. Removed. Elliot reached inside his jacket and produced a device that looked nothing like an ordinary phone. It was thick, dark, and reinforced a matte metal casing with an encrypted keypad. It had the unmistakable appearance of hardware, engineered for secure communications. "This is a satellite phone," Elliot said. "It bypasses standard telecommunications networks." He turned the screen toward me. It connected directly to secure international banking systems. I noticed a number was already entered on the display. Elliot extended the phone across the console. "Take it?" For a moment I only looked at it. Then I reached out and accepted it. The device was heavier than it appeared. The metal casing sat solid against my rough, calloused palm. I pressed the green call button. The connection opened at once. For a few seconds there was nothing but the soft percussion of rain against the ghost's thick windows. Then the line clicked. A voice answered immediately. The voice on the line was composed precise, unmistakably European in its cadence. "You have reached the private client executive division of Geneva Central Banking Group," it announced with crisp clarity. A brief silence followed. "Please state your secure account identification code." I pressed the receiver against my ear and listened. And in that moment, for the first time that night, something became clear to me. Elliot hadn't come to pick me up by chance. He had been building toward this for a very long time. I closed my eyes, forcing my mind back exactly 5 years. The memory came with startling precision. When I first signed the papers, establishing the blind trust, the careful attorney overseeing the offshore transfer had insisted on building in a fail-safe. He walked me through it, methodically moving $500,000 into an international corporate entity. He explained required a master override mechanism in case the managing director ever acts against the interests of the primary shareholder. At the time, I'd seen it as unnecessary caution. Derek had been family. I had trusted him without reservation. But the lawyer held firm. And so, the system was put in place. My mind sharpened by decades of mechanical work, trained to hold thousands of engine specifications, torque values, and part numbers, had absorbed the security sequence without effort. The long string of letters and numbers rose to the surface cleanly. "I am calling to initiate a complete master override on the Voss Holding Trust." I said, my voice level, as I spoke into the satellite phone. My voice didn't waver. "The primary account identifier is Delta 7 Tango 9 Echo 442. A brief pause hung on the line. Then came the rapid clicking of keys at the other end. "I can locate the trust within our international registry." The banker responded with deliberate care. His tone carried the particular precision of someone trained to handle enormous sums without blinking. "However, this account is currently under the management authority of a registered corporate director. To override that authority, we must confirm the identity of the primary equity holder through our multi-tier authentication protocol." "Proceed," I said quietly. I fixed my gaze on the dark leather partition between us and the driver. "I am ready," the banker began. "What was the make, model, and year of the first vehicle you personally restored?" The question didn't slow me for even a heartbeat. "A 1968 Ford Mustang, boss, 429, I answered without hesitation. "Painted midnight blue." A pause. "Correct," the banker said. The keystrokes continued. "Next question. What was the maiden name of the woman you married in the winter of 1971? A brief, sharp ache moved through my chest. "My wife." Her smile flickered across my mind, and I pressed it down. "Pruitt," I said steadily. "Her maiden name was Pruitt. We had shared the same last name before we ever laid eyes on each other." The typing went on. "That answer is verified." The banker's tone held steady. "We will now proceed to the final authentication layer." My grip tightened slightly on the satellite phone. "To authorize a global freeze on a corporate entity of this scale," the banker continued, "the primary equity holder must provide the master security passphrase established at the time the trust was created." I drew a slow, quiet breath. Outside, rain continued to beat against the glass in a steady rhythm. Across from me, Elliot sat without a word. His eyes were fixed on me, reading every small movement. He understood precisely what was unfolding. The weight of what I held in that moment was immense. 5 years earlier, when I chose the passphrase, my reason had been simple. I wanted Derek to carry a reminder of where his salvation had truly come from, even if my name never once appeared on any official document. "The master passphrase is rust and ruined iron," I said, clearly making certain every syllable carried through the encrypted line. "Rust and ruined iron." The line went still. The seconds stretched into something that felt far longer. I could make out the faint digital hum of the satellite signal, carrying my voice across the ocean. My pulse stayed even. Something had shifted in me tonight. I was no longer the broken old man left sitting on a wet driveway. I was the man who had built the empire in the first place, and I was taking it back. The banker returned. His voice sounded identical, composed, measured without emotion, but there was an unmistakable gravity behind it now. Voice verification complete. "Mr. Pruitt." A brief pause. "All corporate and personal financial accounts connected to Derek Voss are now frozen." The words settled into the quiet cabin like the final strike of a judge's gavel. It was finished. 5 years of deception had been undone in a single phone call. I lowered the satellite phone slowly. The click of the disconnected line sounded sharper than I'd expected. For a moment, I sat still, letting the reality of what had just happened settle over me. Derek's empire, his company accounts. His investments, his personal assets had all been locked down. The financial lifeblood of everything he had built was cut off completely. I passed the phone back to Elliot. He took it with a small, satisfied nod and returned it to his jacket pocket. Neither of us said anything. There was no need. The thick silence inside the Rolls-Royce Ghost carried its own weight. Somewhere up in the hills behind us, Derek Voss was still celebrating. He was probably standing at the center of his lavish party champagne glass, raised beaming at wealthy investors who believed they were on the verge of a lucrative opportunity. He had no idea what had just occurred. The empire he believed he commanded had just been locked down by the man he'd thrown out into the rain. Elliot reached for the tablet resting on the polished walnut console. His fingers moved swiftly across the screen. A secure application opened, presenting a grid of video feeds, security cameras. Elliot turned the tablet toward me. "Let's watch what happens next," he said quietly. On the screen, the grand foyer of the Atherton mansion came into view. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead. Elegant guests moved across the marble floor, champagne-in-hand conversations flowing with animation. At the center of it all stood Derek, impeccably dressed, poised smiling, as he held court with a small circle of investors. He looked every bit the successful entrepreneur the room believed him to be. But I now knew something none of them did. Within minutes, Derek Voss's world was going to come apart. My eyes narrowed as I focused on the tablet in Elliot's hand. The image on the screen sharpened into crisp detail, and it became clear almost immediately that what I was looking at was no simple digital map. It was a live feed high-definition streaming directly from inside the Atherton mansion. For a moment, I just stared. "Vanguard Holdings doesn't only freeze bank accounts," Leonard Elliott said evenly. His voice carried the steady, almost mechanical assurance of someone who had run operations like this before. "About 10 minutes ago, my intelligence team gained administrative control of Derek's smart home network." He gestured toward the screen without urgency. "That means we now control everything tied to it. Every security camera, every electronic door lock, every lighting system, every alarm in the house." I leaned forward without thinking, pulled completely into what was unfolding on that screen. The camera feed swept across the vast foyer and into the grand ballroom. The party was running at full force. More than 150 of the wealthiest people in California filled the space beneath glittering crystal chandeliers. Their voices merged into a warm hum of laughter and conversation as they moved through the room in polished clusters. Waiters dressed in spotless black dress shirts and white gloves moved gracefully between guests carrying silver trays stacked with delicate appetizers and glasses of champagne. The whole atmosphere breathed wealth, power, and privilege, and right there at its center stood Derek. He looked exactly as he always did when performing for an audience. Tailored tuxedo shoulders back a glass of vintage wine, turning lazily in his hand. He stood with a tight circle of older men in expensive suits, private investors. I recognized them immediately. These were the men he intended to deceive. Derek smiled wide, speaking with easy charm, clearly savoring every bit of their attention. From the outside, he looked like a man who owned the room, confident, untouchable, a king holding court. He had no idea that only minutes before the financial ground beneath his polished Italian shoes had vanished. As I watched the performance play out, another figure moved into the camera's frame, the head caterer. The man wore a dark suit and held a small digital payment terminal in one hand. His approach was cautious, almost tentative as he stepped toward Derek. He waited until a small gap opened in the conversation, then leaned in slightly and murmured something into Derek's ear. I couldn't make out the audio, but I already knew exactly what was happening. Elliot touched the screen and expanded that particular camera feed. The image pulled in tight until Derek and the caterer filled the entire display. "The catering company requires final payment before serving the main course," Elliot said calmly, narrating the scene like a chess commentator calling out a move. $50,000 for the imported Wagyu and vintage champagne. He hesitated slightly. "They don't extend credit." Derek rolled his eyes in irritation. The interruption clearly grated on him. Even so, he recovered in an instant, turning back to the investors with a smooth, easy smile before stepping away for a moment. Then his hand moved into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He drew out a sleek palladium metal credit card, a J.P. Morgan Reserve card, the kind of card reserved only for individuals of extraordinary means. To most people, that card represented limitless financial power. Derek barely glanced at the caterer as he passed it over. The gesture was offhand, almost contemptuous, as though $50,000 were nothing worth acknowledging. The caterer took the card with a respectful nod and fed it into the payment terminal. His fingers worked quickly across the keypad to enter the charge. $50,000. Then he waited. Several seconds ticked by. The caterer's expression changed. His brow creased as he looked down at the screen. He pulled the card out, buffed the chip against his jacket sleeve, and tried once more. Derek caught the delay. His polished smile dimmed. He leaned in toward the caterer and said something low, but the impatience behind it was plain. The caterer shook his head. Then he rotated the payment terminal so Derek could read the display himself. Even without sound, there was no misreading it. Declined. A cold wave of quiet satisfaction settled in my chest. The first domino had gone down. Derek's reaction came without any delay. He snatched the card back from the caterer's hand, his face flushing deep red with sudden embarrassment. Around him, the investors kept up their conversations, though a few had begun glancing over with mild interest. Derek moved quickly to open his wallet. He produced a second card, a platinum corporate credit card, tied directly to his real estate holding company. His movements had shed their smoothness. They were clipped tense. He thrust the second card toward the caterer, while stealing a nervous look back at the investors. The caterer ran it. The machine processed the request. 1 second, 2, 3, 5 long seconds dragged past. Then the red light blinked on again. Declined. Derek stared at the terminal, as if it had turned against him. He stood motionless for a beat. The confident businessman who had been charming that room only minutes before suddenly looked seized up and hollow. The arrogance, the swagger, the carefully maintained illusion of power, all of it dissolved in a single moment. Derek yanked out his phone. His hands were trembling now. Elliot dragged his finger across the tablet screen. The camera feed tightened its focus on the glowing display of Derek's smartphone. Notifications were flooding in. Alerts, warnings, account suspended, corporate access, denied, assets frozen. Message after message stacked up across the screen in rapid succession. Every financial institution Derek depended on had cut him off at the same instant. His empire, his accounts, his companies, his personal credit had all been locked down simultaneously. The color left Derek's face. The blood drained from his cheeks until his skin looked nearly ashen under the chandelier light. His breathing went shallow and ragged as the full weight of it began pressing down on him. For the first time that night, Derek Voss looked precisely like what he actually was, a man whose world had just caved in. But the nightmare descending on that mansion was still only getting started. As Derek stood there staring at the frozen bank alerts flashing across his phone, a new notification slid onto the screen. It appeared without a sound, settling in above the financial warnings, like the last nail driven into a lid. An encrypted text message. The sender's number was unknown, yet the words glowing on that screen were unmistakable in their meaning. Time is up. We are coming to collect. Derek went still. The security camera captured everything with sharp, unsparing clarity. His eyes widened as he read it. For a moment it looked as though the air had been pulled straight out of him. That short sentence hung there like a death warrant. The Russian syndicate had made their move. I watched his chest begin rising and falling in quick, unsteady bursts. The man who had looked so composed and untouchable only minutes earlier now seemed diminished, smaller, somehow stripped of something essential. His perfectly tailored tuxedo, which had been a banner of wealth and authority, now looked like a costume on a man who had forgotten what role he was playing. Derek shoved the phone back into his pocket with shaking fingers. Then he began scanning the ballroom. His gaze jumped to the front entrance, fixing on the massive oak doors, as though he expected them to be blown open at any second. He understood what the message meant. The men he owed $10 million were done waiting. They were on their way, and they were coming now. Watching him come undone stirred something deep and quiet in me, a bone-level sense of justice. For years he had treated me as though I were worthless, a burden to be discarded. Now the mask was splitting open. For the first time, Derek Voss looked genuinely afraid. But just as I let myself settle into that grim satisfaction, Elliot reached forward and pressed a button on the side of the tablet. The screen went dark instantly, the live feed cut off. The glowing ballroom, the terrified man at the center of it, the entire unfolding collapse, all of it, vanished in a single second. The Rolls-Royce Ghost's interior lights caught the black reflection of the dead screen as silence reclaimed the cabin. I turned toward Elliot, thrown. "Why did you shut it off?" I asked, the sharpness in my voice plain. I want to see what happens when those men come through his doors." Elliot stayed calm. He poured the last drop of bourbon into his glass before he answered. "Watching him panic is satisfying," he said. "But we're not here tonight for entertainment." He took a slow sip. "Our objective runs far deeper than humiliating Derek Voss." Elliot set the glass down carefully on the polished walnut console. "His finances are in ruins. His corporate accounts are frozen. He can no longer steal from those investors." He paused. "And the Russian syndicate will handle the rest of his problems soon enough." Elliot settled back against the leather seat. "But we are dealing with a man who built his entire career on manipulating systems and rewriting his own story." His eyes found mine. "Right now, Derek is a cornered animal." He let that land. "Cornered animals are dangerous." I shifted in my seat, the cold damp of my soaked suit pressing uncomfortably against my skin. "If we drive away tonight," Elliot continued, "and leave him to face the fallout on his own, we leave one very serious gap open." I frowned. "What gap?" I gestured toward the folder resting on the polished walnut console. "I froze every corporate account he controls. I used the master override. His empire is finished." Elliot shook his head, slow and deliberate. "Financial destruction is not the same as legal justice." His tone was measured but firm. "Right now, Derek Voss is broke. Completely broke." He paused. "But tomorrow morning, the police will get involved." Elliot leaned forward slightly. "And when that happens, Derek will immediately retain the most aggressive defense attorneys that money can buy." He watched my face. "Those lawyers will look at the account freeze you triggered tonight and argue it was nothing more than a misunderstanding." My stomach tightened. "They will claim that you, an elderly man with failing memory, grew confused and accidentally activated the override." Elliot's voice stayed analytical, almost clinical. "They will say you misread the legal structure of the trust." My jaw set hard. "And they will produce the document you signed last month, the equity waiver." Elliot pressed on. "They will argue that you voluntarily gave up your 80% ownership stake and that you are now nothing more than a bitter father-in-law trying to tear down a successful entrepreneur." The words put a burn in my chest. "They will reshape the entire story," Elliot said steadily. "They will insist Derek never forged a thing, and without hard evidence, federal prosecutors will have nothing to bring a charge with." The reality struck me the way cold water does, sudden and total. Derek had always been a master at bending the truth to his advantage. Even now, with criminals hunting him and his finances in ruins, he might still find a way out. If he walked away from prison, he would simply rebuild somewhere else and go right back to doing exactly what he had always done. "What do we need?" I asked quietly, though there was a harder edge behind it now. "What evidence actually puts him away for good?" Elliot set his glass down. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation will require the original trust contract." He spoke with careful precision. "The physical document, the one you signed 5 years ago." Elliot touched the folder lightly. "We need the original paper bearing the wet ink signatures." He paused. "That document establishes the structure of the trust. It proves that the equity waiver Derek slipped into those medical forms directly contradicts the original legal charter." Elliot looked straight at me. "A digital copy won't survive the courtroom. His attorneys will shred it, but the original contract." He allowed a thin, quiet smile. "That will destroy him." I closed my eyes. My mind went back to that day 5 years before. I had trusted Derek with my investment, but I hadn't been careless enough to leave something that important anywhere near his house. "I still have it," I said quietly. I opened my eyes. I placed the original contract inside a secure safety deposit box. I said slowly, "At a private vault facility in downtown San Francisco. No one else knows it's there, and no one else has the authority to open it." Elliot gave a single nod. "Good." His voice sharpened with fresh purpose. "Then we go get it immediately." He gestured toward the dark highway stretching ahead. "We collect the contract and deliver it straight to my contacts inside the Federal Bureau." Elliot held my gaze. "Once the FBI has that document, Derek Voss will never see the outside of a prison again." He paused briefly. "Do you have the vault key on you?" The question settled in the air. For a moment I said nothing. A sickening feeling had already begun to take shape in my stomach. My mind snapped back to the mansion, the grand foyer, the shattered wooden box lying on the marble floor, the small titanium key tumbling from my shaking hands. I could see my daughter clearly standing there in her stunning gown. I could see the revulsion on her face. Then I saw the small hand-carved oak box slip through my fingers, strike the marble floor, and break apart into pieces. I turned and looked through the rain-streaked window of the Rolls-Royce Ghost, my eyes traveling back up the long driveway toward the mansion. The realization came down on me like a falling wall. "It's in a safety deposit box," I whispered, my voice unsteady as the terrible truth settled in, and the only titanium key that opens it was sitting inside that hand-carved wooden box my daughter just kicked into the mud. Elliot's eyes fixed on me, those cold, precise eyes widening by the smallest fraction as my words filled the silence of the cabin. The quiet inside that luxury car became suddenly oppressive. He set the heavy crystal glass down slowly onto the polished walnut console, the soft clink landing in the stillness like a sharp crack. A small titanium key. Elliot repeated it, his voice low and edged with intensity. "You are telling me that the only physical access to the master trust document, the one piece of evidence that can put Derek Voss in federal prison and protect my corporate acquisition, was just kicked out into the pouring rain by a spoiled 35-year-old woman?" I nodded slowly, a bitter taste climbing the back of my throat. "Yes," I whispered, staring out through the tinted glass at the dark winding road behind us. I spent 3 full months carving that oak box by hand. I wanted to give her something that actually meant something for her birthday. I set the titanium vault key inside it, laid on a small square of velvet. When I tried to hand it to her in the grand foyer, she struck me. The box dropped and shattered on the hard marble. And when Derek ordered his security staff to haul me out of the house, I saw one of the waiters boot the broken pieces straight out the front doors. It's lying out there now, in the freezing mud exposed to everything. Elliot cursed under his breath, a rare crack in an otherwise seamless professional composure. He snatched up the glowing tablet, and his fingers moved rapidly across the screen, switching back to the live security camera feeds. He bypassed the interior cameras capturing the chaos in the ballroom and pulled up the exterior perimeter surveillance. The high-definition display lit up the grand front gates and the sweeping circular driveway of the Atherton estate. Rain was coming down in heavy gray sheets, turning the pristine landscaping into a dark, sodden mess. We stared hard at the screen, scanning the wet pavement for any sign of the splintered oak box or the glinting metal key. But the driveway was vast, and the driving storm was swallowing the camera's reach. "We cannot simply leave it out there," I said, my pulse beginning to climb with a cold, gripping dread. "If Derek somehow manages to survive tonight, if he finds a way to buy time against the Russian syndicate, he will eventually work out that the digital freeze came from me. He will start hunting for the original documents." Elliot shook his head, his jaw going tight. "It is far worse than that. Leonard," he said, his voice grim. "Look at the lower right corner of the feed." I leaned in toward the small screen. Through the heavy curtain of freezing rain, I could make out 2 men in dark raincoats steering a large, heavy-duty industrial trash cart along the edge of the driveway. They were part of the private estate groundskeeping crew. Derek is a relentless perfectionist about his public image. Elliot's voice carried a sudden urgent edge. He keeps a dedicated team patrolling the outside of his property during every major event. They collect dropped napkins, cigarette ends, any stray debris that might catch the eye of his wealthy guests. They are out there working the driveway right now. I watched in pure horror as one of the groundskeepers dragged a wide broom across the wet asphalt, pushing a heap of wet leaves, mud, and scattered debris toward the large plastic trash cart. "If they sweep up the pieces of your wooden box," Elliot continued, his tone turning grave, "they'll dump it all directly into the commercial incinerator behind the guest house. The estate burns every scrap of event refuse standard practice under their security protocols. If that titanium key goes into the fire, it melts down into an unrecognizable lump of slag. The evidence is gone permanently, and your son-in-law walks away a free man. The full weight of it hit the ceiling of that car. Everything we had just pulled off the frozen accounts, the locked corporate assets, the precisely engineered digital ambush. It would all count for nothing if Derek could simply point to his forged medical waiver as the only surviving legal document. He would craft a sympathetic story for the federal judges. He would work the justice system the way he had always worked everything, keeping his stolen millions while I was left with nothing but an empty life and a fading name. The thought of him standing in a courtroom in one of his expensive suits, smiling while my entire life dissolved into smoke, lit something fierce and unyielding deep in my chest. I was finished being the victim. I was finished living in the shadow of wealth that had been taken from me. I reached over and gently pushed the tablet down, angling it away from Elliot. I looked across at the powerful Wall Street billionaire sitting opposite me. He was waiting quietly, measuring whether the battered old mechanic in front of him had anything left for the fight we had just ignited. I drew a long, steadying breath, feeling the cold damp of my ruined clothes pressing against my skin. But I no longer felt broken. What I felt was something entirely different, a surge of overwhelming clarity, clean and absolute. I turned and fixed my eyes on the thick, soundproofed glass partition between us and the driver up front. "Turn this car around. Now." The command came out of me with a force I hadn't heard in my own voice for years, steady carrying, impossible to argue with. Elliot raised an eyebrow. A faint, dangerous smile crossed his face. He pressed a silver button and relayed the order. I reached up and slowly buttoned my wine-stained jacket. "We are crashing the party." The massive tires of the midnight black Rolls-Royce Ghost shrieked against the wet asphalt as the driver executed a sharp, decisive turn in the middle of the dark road. The engine surged with a deep-throated roar that matched something stirring inside me. I settled back against the leather seat, hands resting still on my knees. I was no longer trembling from the cold or from the sting of my daughter's cruelty. Every trace of fear, every last thread of hesitation had been burned clean away. What remained was hard and clear and quiet. We were heading back into the heart of it. The rain kept hammering the windshield, but the car cut through the storm without effort. Elliot sat across from me, without a word, his eyes on the glowing tablet in his lap, tracking the live security feeds from the estate. The winding road back up into the private hills of Atherton rolled past in a wash of dark trees and amber street lamps. Within minutes, the towering, fortified front entrance of the $15 million mansion rose into view. Under normal circumstances, visitors pulled up to a heavily secured intercom, stated their business, and waited for the wrought iron gates to swing open. Tonight, however, Derek had instructed his staff to leave the gates standing wide to accommodate the steady stream of wealthy guests and luxury vehicles arriving throughout the evening. In place of the closed gates, the groundskeeping crew had constructed an elaborate welcoming corridor of towering floral arrangements, velvet ropes, and temporary valet stands, a grand entrance befitting an exclusive birthday celebration. 2 security guards in bright yellow raincoats stood squarely in the middle of the entrance, holding glowing traffic wands to direct the arriving guests. I expected the driver of our Rolls-Royce Ghost to ease off the gas and pull up calmly to the valet stand, the way civilized men arrive at a party, but Elliot had already delivered a very different set of instructions through his earpiece. The massive car did not slow by a single fraction. Instead, the driver pushed his foot hard onto the accelerator. The engine answered with a terrifying surge of power. The 2 guards by the velvet ropes threw their eyes wide open in pure panic, diving out of the way a split second before the heavy armored front grille of the Rolls-Royce Ghost tore straight through the expensive floral barricade. The impact was enormous. Thick wooden trellises snapped like dry kindling. Hundreds of precisely arranged white roses and rare orchids were flung into the dark, wet sky. The velvet ropes ripped clean from their brass stanchions and whipped through the freezing air. The car obliterated the grand welcoming entrance entirely, leaving a long wake of splintered wood and crushed flowers across the driveway. We barreled up the long, curving drive, the wide tires throwing up heavy arcs of muddy water on both sides. The car finally lurched to a violent, abrupt stop directly before the grand marble steps of the main entrance, cutting off a gleaming silver Ferrari belonging to one of the rattled tech investors. Chaos broke loose immediately outside the thick, soundproofed glass. The force of the crash had triggered Derek's entire private security operation in an instant. Within seconds, more than a dozen large men in matching dark suits poured out from every corner of the property. They closed in around the midnight black Rolls-Royce Ghost faces, set with the hardened, trained aggression of men paid to hurt people. Several of them reached under their jackets, hands settling on the weapons holstered at their sides. The head of the detail, a towering broad man with a heavy beard, came striding directly toward the car, his expression making it absolutely plain he intended to rip the doors open and drag us out into the rain. A brief, sharp spike of adrenaline moved through me. We were completely encircled by hostile men, but Elliot Crane simply smiled, a cold, predatory expression that radiated something far more dangerous than aggression. He calmly reached over and pressed a small silver button on the center console. The heavy locks on the Rolls-Royce Ghost released with a solid, satisfying click. At that same moment, the doors of the two large black SUVs that had been following us the entire time swung open. 8 of Elliot's elite private bodyguards stepped out into the downpour. They didn't shout. They didn't gesture. They simply moved with quiet, absolute precision, forming a dense, impenetrable wall of dark suits around our vehicle. The head of Derek's security froze mid-stride, his eyes moving rapidly between Elliot's men. Elliot calmly pressed another button, lowering his tinted window by only a few inches. The freezing air rushed in immediately, carrying the noise of shouting guards from outside. The security chief bent down toward the gap, his face crimson with fury, ready to unleash everything he had on whoever was sitting inside that car. But the instant his eyes connected with Elliot's cold, steady gaze through the narrow opening, every drop of color left his face. Elliot spoke very quietly. "Good evening, Gavin. I trust the funds cleared without complications." The massive security chief seemed to collapse inward. His hand fell away from his weapon. "Yes, Mr. Crane," Gavin answered, betraying Derek without another breath. "Stand down," he called out to his men, waving them back. Gavin pulled our door open with genuine deference. Flanked by men in black, I stepped out and moved through the front entrance. I had been thrown out of this house less than an hour ago. Now I was walking back through those massive oak doors. The atmosphere inside the grand foyer changed the moment I crossed the threshold. A jazz trio stopped playing mid-note. The elegant murmur of wealthy guests died away, instantly swallowed by a thick, pressing silence. Every pair of eyes in that vast, high-ceilinged room found the wine-soaked old man who had been dragged out into the freezing rain not long before. I kept walking. My worn shoes left faint wet marks across the imported Italian marble. Elliot Crane followed in silence at my right shoulder, flanked by his 8 bodyguards. We moved like a single formation, cutting through contested ground. Derek was standing near the center of the ballroom, encircled by a handful of wealthy tech investors. He was deep into what was clearly a desperate pitch hands, moving voice animated, doing everything in his power to get those fraudulent contracts signed. The moment he saw me coming toward him, every trace of color left his face. The gold-plated pen he'd been holding slipped from his fingers and clattered against the polished walnut table. What are you doing here?" Derek choked out his voice, fracturing under barely controlled panic. "Gavin, where the hell is my security?" The head of security stood near the entrance with his arms folded, making no move whatsoever. I came to a stop directly in front of Derek, close enough to see the beads of cold sweat already forming on his forehead. I did not raise my voice. I had no need to. "I am here to reclaim what is mine." The words came out quiet, and they reached every corner of that silent ballroom without effort. Derek's mouth opened and closed. He looked desperately around at the investors surrounding him, silently pleading for someone to validate him to prop up his version of events. But the oldest man at that table, a silver-haired billionaire whose face had appeared on the cover of every major financial publication, took one slow, deliberate step backward, putting distance between himself and the man crumbling in front of him. Elliot Crane, the silver-haired man, breathed, his voice barely a whisper. The name moved through the circle of investors like a current. A tone of fearful reverence passed between them, and the atmosphere in the room shifted entirely. Derek, still visibly shaking from his own outburst, finally pulled his eyes away from my stained jacket. He followed the silver-haired billionaire's stunned gaze and registered for the first time the imposing figure standing in the shadows directly behind my right shoulder. What happened to Derek in that instant was immediate and deeply revealing. The hot flush of anger drained clean from his face, replaced by something pale and hungry. He knew the man. Every ambitious executive in the country knew the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. Derek's panicked mind, completely oblivious to the trap that had been closing around him all evening, wildly misread the scene in front of him. He actually convinced himself that Elliot Crane had crashed this birthday party to swoop in with a last-minute investment in his failing company. Derek quickly smoothed the lapels of his tailored tuxedo, forcing the pieces of his composure back into place. He manufactured a wide, confident smile and stepped past me as though I were a piece of broken furniture blocking the hallway, something to be moved around, not acknowledged. He came around the polished walnut table with his hand already extended toward the Wall Street titan. "Mr. Crane," Derek announced, his voice soaked in a nauseating performative reverence. "What an extraordinary honor to have you here tonight in my home. I had absolutely no idea you were in California. Had my staff known you were coming, we would have arranged something far more fitting for you. Please come in." Derek gestured generously toward the three billionaires who were staring at Elliot in stunned, uneasy silence. "We are just wrapping up an exciting round of exclusive funding, but there is always room at this table for Vanguard Holdings. We have been looking to build a partnership with your organization for a very long time. Let me have my security remove this confused old man from your path so we can have a real conversation in my private office right now." Elliot did not look at Derek's outstretched hand. He did not acknowledge the greeting in any form. Instead, he stepped out of the shadows, suit immaculate, completely dry, the contrast with my soaked, ruined clothes, sharp and deliberate. He moved with the unhurried, quiet confidence of a predator that has already decided how this ends. Elliot walked straight past Derek, leaving him suspended there, with his hand extended into empty air. He stopped in front of the polished walnut table and looked down at the three heavy leather portfolios holding the fraudulent $15 million contracts. He reached out and closed the cover of the nearest one, the motion slow and entirely precise. Then he turned his cold gaze back to Derek. The entire crowd of wealthy socialites and powerful tech figures leaned forward, completely absorbed by the raw confrontation playing out in front of them. Not one person dared to speak or draw a breath too loudly. Every person in that room could sense that something final was about to happen, right here in the middle of this $15 million mansion. The tension in the air was dense enough to press against your skin. The lavish, extravagant birthday celebration had transformed in an instant into a merciless courtroom, and Derek was standing before the ultimate judge with no defense, prepared, no exit, visible, completely unaware of the full magnitude of what had arrived at his door. Elliot turned his back on Derek, a deliberate total dismissal, and looked directly at the three billionaire investors standing motionless at the table. He filled his lungs, commanding the attention of every soul in that enormous room. "Gentlemen," Elliot announced, his deep authoritative voice carrying through the grand foyer with the force of a verdict, "I would strongly advise you to put your pens away. Do not sign that contract." The statement struck the silence like something physical. Derek lurched forward in blind, instinctive panic hands, reaching out as though he could somehow claw the words back from the air. He began to stammer, fighting to assemble some coherent defense before his empire finished collapsing beneath him. His mind gave him nothing. He was cornered completely. Elliot raised a single hand, and the broken man fell silent before he could form a single word. The man who was standing at that microphone only moments ago is a fraud. Elliot continued, his tone precise and without mercy. He holds no legal title to this real estate empire. He has no authority whatsoever to sell a single share of corporate equity tonight. The true 80% majority shareholder of this entire corporation, the man who built every piece of it from nothing, is standing right here. Elliot turned and pointed directly at me. "It is Mr. Leonard Pruitt, the man you just had thrown out into the freezing rain." The gasp that went through the crowd hit the foyer like a thunderclap. The hush broke into a surge of urgent whispers. All three billionaire investors pushed back from the polished walnut table. They regarded Derek the way men regard something contaminated and dangerous. The gold pen sat untouched on the table. The fraudulent $15 million contracts remained unsigned. Derek stood rigid, his styled hair plastered to his damp forehead. His eyes swung between the retreating investors, the Wall Street titan, and finally came to rest on me. The panic curdled into something more. Animal, a raw survival drive. He threw his hands up and manufactured a hollow laugh. "This is completely absurd," Derek stammered, his voice cracking as he fought to reclaim the room. "Gentlemen, please do not let this theater distract you. Mr. Crane is clearly operating on the basis of a terrible misunderstanding." He leveled a trembling finger at my face, his eyes wide and frantic. "This man is my father-in-law, and he is seriously ill. He has been living with advanced dementia for over 3 years. His grip on reality is gone. I brought him into my home because he could no longer look after himself. He wanders. He invents elaborate stories about owning my company. He doesn't own anything. He is a sick, confused old man who needs medical attention right now." Derek swept his gaze across his wealthy audience. "I built this empire with my own hands. Are you genuinely going to let a confused old mechanic destroy a $15 million partnership?" The lies came out polished and practiced. Years of deceiving the people closest to him had given him that much. For just a moment, I saw a flicker of uncertainty move across the face of the silver-haired investor. And the lie was plausible to these men. It was easier, far easier to accept that an elderly man in a ruined suit had lost his mind than to believe their charming, successful tech executive was a predatory criminal. I understood I had to sever the head from the snake right here, right now, without hesitation. I walked slowly past the wall of Elliot Crane's bodyguards, deliberately unhurried, letting every person in that room take a long look at my face. I moved with purpose. I stopped in front of the polished walnut table, standing only inches from the man who had taken 5 years of my life. Elliot caught my eye, gave a single approving nod, and placed the silver microphone in my hand. I closed my worn, calloused fingers around the cool metal. I took a steady breath, feeling the full weight of what this moment meant settle across my shoulders. When I spoke, my voice did not tremble. It rose through those high-vaulted ceilings with the unmistakable clarity of a man who has nothing left to fear. "My name is Leonard Pruitt," I said, holding the gaze of the 3 billionaire investors, "and my mind is perfectly clear. 5 years ago, my son-in-law showed up at my modest home in Cleveland. He was bankrupt, buried under crushing personal debt, and weeping like a desperate man with nowhere left to turn. He begged me to save his career. I sold my mechanic shop. I liquidated my retirement fund. I gathered exactly $500, every penny I had to my name, and I handed it to him. He was terrified of his wife finding out he had failed, so he had me place the funds into a heavily secured blind trust. The ballroom was perfectly still, every person in it holding on to my words. Because of the precise legal structure of that trust, I continued, my voice gaining force with each sentence, that $500,000 served as the sole seed capital for this entire holding company. Derek never bought me out. He simply concealed the truth. That original investment compounded over time, leaving me as the sole legal owner of exactly 80% of this entire corporate empire. Derek gasped, stumbling backward a half step. "No," he whispered the word, barely making it out of him, as he watched his buried secrets being pulled into the light. "Just 1 month ago," I said, sweeping my gaze back across the crowd, he handed me a stack of what he described as routine medical insurance forms. He used the trust I placed in him as a weapon. Hidden inside those papers was a fraudulent equity waiver. He manipulated me into signing away my 80% ownership stake so he could take the entire company for himself. He believed I was nothing more than an uneducated old man who wouldn't notice. He believed he could have me thrown out into the rain tonight, finalize the theft by morning, and be done with me forever. I took a step toward Derek. His eyes were already darting in the direction of the front doors, his legs calculating the distance. "But the worst part of his scheme is the reason all of you are here tonight," I said, pointing directly at the 3 stricken investors. "You were not invited to celebrate my daughter. You are here because Derek Voss currently owes exactly $10 million to a highly organized and deeply dangerous Russian syndicate. He lost his capital at underground high-stakes poker tables. He brought you here tonight to trick you into signing those contracts to steal your $15 million, settle his debt with the mob, and leave you holding a gutted, debt-ridden shell." The room detonated into chaos. The investors erupted in anger, snatching their coats and pushing away from the table. The illusion was gone. Derek dropped to his knees, the last reserves of whatever had been holding him upright, draining out of him completely. I looked down at the trembling, diminished man who had taken everything from me. I looked directly into his wide, terrified eyes, brought the silver microphone to my lips, and delivered the final blow. As majority shareholder, I am officially declaring this company bankrupt and liquidating all assets. You have nothing. The silence that swallowed my words lasted less than a heartbeat. Then the room came apart entirely. The 3 billionaire investors moved without deliberation. Men who had built fortunes on the sharp edge of risk, knew how to read disaster the moment it showed its face. They recognized in an instant when something had turned poisonous, when a vessel had begun to sink beyond any saving. The silver-haired investor shoved his chair back so sharply it scraped across the marble with a sound like a gunshot. The gold-plated pen he had been carrying rolled across the polished walnut table and came to rest beside the fraudulent $15 million contract. He left it there without a glance. Instead, he raised a hand toward the 2 large men stationed discreetly near the wall, his security detail. The other 2 investors didn't need to be told twice. Chairs scraped back. Jackets were pulled on. Phones went into pockets as the 3 men moved briskly away from the table. Every trace of their polished composure was gone. What remained was pure instinct. They pushed through the stunned crowd of party guests, brushing past confused questions and startled protests, heading straight for the front entrance. They didn't look back once. Within moments, they were gone, and with them walked Derek's last remaining chance at survival. The ballroom churned with anxious, bewildered whispers as the guests struggled to process what they had just witnessed. At the center of all of it, Derek Voss remained on his knees. What you were about to witness is the moment everything I had quietly prepared finally came to bear, and the man standing in that ballroom had no idea how completely the ground had already shifted beneath his feet. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If someone close to you had been working against you for years, would you confront them the moment you found out? Or would you wait, gather everything, and let the truth speak for itself? His expensive tuxedo bunched and pulled awkwardly against him as he sank to the marble floor. The once immaculate lines of that suit were now twisted and creased beyond recognition. His chest heaved in rapid, desperate bursts while his hands clawed at either side of his head. He looked nothing like a powerful CEO. He looked like a man watching everything he'd built crumble to dust in real time. Then a sharp voice cut through the rising chaos. "What is going on here, Celeste?" The words sliced across the ballroom like a blade drawn fast. My daughter shouldered her way through the crowd of rattled socialites, pushing past guests who were still struggling to make sense of the disaster unfolding in front of them. Her glittering birthday gown swished with fury around her legs as she swept into the center of the room. Her eyes found me instantly, and they were blazing. "Why are you still here?" she demanded, her voice bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. "I told security to have you removed." "You are ruining my party. You are humiliating me." Derek said nothing. He didn't even raise his head. He just stared down at the marble beneath him, as if some answer might somehow be inscribed there. Celeste let out a sharp, impatient scoff. To her, this still looked like nothing more than a petty family squabble. She had no idea the foundation beneath her entire life had already given way. She reached into her glittering diamond-studded clutch and pulled out her phone with an irritated flick of her wrist. "You don't own a thing," she sneered at me. "Derek is the CEO. Our company is worth tens of millions." Her voice was thick with arrogant certainty. "I'm calling my private bankers this instant to put an end to this nonsense." Her fingers flew across the screen as she opened her financial application. I said nothing. I simply stood and watched. It took fewer than 3 seconds. The smugness drained from her face so fast, it looked almost unnatural. Her lips fell open as she stared at the glowing screen in pure disbelief. For a moment, no words came. The pale light of the phone lit her face from below, and what it revealed was unmistakable. Every account, every credit line, every joint investment, zero frozen, gone. Her hand began to shake. "We're broke," she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound. Her eyes jumped to Derek. "All of our accounts are locked." Her breathing went shallow as the truth finally forced its way through. "We have nothing." But before Derek could manage even the beginning of a response, the atmosphere inside the grand foyer shifted again. And this time, the shift was far more dangerous than any frozen bank account. The howl of the storm outside was suddenly pierced by the high-pitched wail of approaching sirens. The sound grew louder and more aggressive, with every passing second echoing ominously through the exclusive hills of Atherton. The massive arched windows facing the circular driveway blazed with a frantic strobing display of red and blue. The pulsing lights slashed through the heavy rain, throwing terrifying shadows across the imported Italian marble floors. The remaining guests, already badly shaken by the corporate scandal unraveling in front of them, dissolved into full panic. Wealthy tech executives, well-known socialites, and powerful politicians scrambled desperately toward the side exits, terrified of being photographed or legally tied to whatever criminal enterprise was about to come violently apart. They didn't get far. The heavy oak front doors were thrown open with explosive, terrifying force. More than 24 federal agents poured into the grand foyer, their heavy tactical boots hammering against the delicate floors. Dark windbreakers bore large, bold yellow letters across their backs, Federal Bureau of Investigation. They moved with total coordinated precision, instantly sealing every exit and blocking anyone from leaving the $15 million estate. The lead agent, an imposing man with a hard expression and a thick folder tucked under his arm, stepped directly into the center of the room. He raised his badge high, his booming voice cutting effortlessly through the screams of the panicked elite. "Nobody moves. the federal agent's command carried undeniable authority. This entire property is officially on lockdown. We are executing a federal search and seizure warrant for multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering. Elliot Crane stood quietly in the shadows beside me, a faint, satisfied smile resting on his lips. His elite forensic team had done far more than trace Derek's illegal syndicate debts. They had delivered a perfectly assembled dossier of financial crimes straight into the hands of federal authorities. The crushing reality of federal prison had finally landed on Derek's shoulders. He scrambled to his feet, eyes darting wildly as agents began forcibly confiscating computers and financial records from his frightened staff. His mind raced through the extremely narrow odds he was now facing. He knew the massive digital freeze would raise red flags, but he desperately needed his defense attorneys to argue that the fraudulent medical waiver was the only legitimate transfer of corporate equity. For that lie to hold up in federal court, he had to ensure that the authentic trust document was completely and permanently destroyed. And the only physical means of accessing that document was sitting inside a small splintered oak box, somewhere out in the freezing mud. Derek suddenly seized the collar of his terrified head butler, shaking the poor, bewildered man violently. "Find the old man's wooden box!" Derek shrieked, his voice raw and utterly broken, completely oblivious to the armed federal agents closing in around him. "I don't care what it costs or what it takes. Go out to the trash, dig through the freezing mud with your bare hands. Find it." The trembling butler stood paralyzed in Derek's grip, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavily armed agents advancing across the foyer. Before the man could form a single coherent word, two large federal agents intervened with force. They grabbed Derek by the shoulders, wrenched his hands off the terrified staff member, and shoved the disgraced chief executive back with unmistakable authority. "Stand down and keep your hands where we can see them." The lead agent's voice cracked through the room like thunder. Derek stumbled backward, breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His expensive custom tuxedo was now thoroughly disheveled, the crisp collar bent sideways, his perfectly styled hair hanging in damp, matted strands across his pale, sweating forehead. He ignored the federal agents entirely, his wild, bloodshot eyes sweeping the room, the massive oak doors, the arched windows, desperately trying to calculate the impossible logistics of locating a tiny wooden box in the middle of a torrential downpour. The sheer desperation radiating off him was a pathetic thing to witness. This was the celebrated tech visionary, the untouchable architect of a real estate empire, reduced completely to a frantic, broken animal scraping through garbage to save his own life. A heavy silence fell over what remained of the party guests and the federal agents alike. Everyone watched the spectacular unraveling of Derek Voss, a man who had flown too close to the sun on wings built entirely from stolen money. I stood there in my wet, ruined clothes, feeling the weight of the room's collective gaze slowly settle back onto me. The burning fury that had driven me through the storm and past his security team had quieted now into something deep and immovable. I looked at the man who had stolen my life savings, the man who had ordered me thrown out into the freezing mud like a worthless stray. I watched him come apart at the seams, knowing exactly what he was looking for, and knowing with perfect certainty that he would never find it out there in the dark. "Here are you looking for this, Derek?" I asked. My voice wasn't raised, but in the absolute silence of that grand foyer, it carried with total, undeniable clarity. Derek froze. Every frantic movement stopped at once. He turned his head slowly, his wide, terrified eyes locking onto mine. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as one. I reached my right hand slowly into the deep pocket of my soaked, wine-stained suit jacket, feeling the cold, damp fabric press against my skin. My fingers found the rough, jagged edges of splintered wood, and then the smooth, cold surface of polished metal. I drew my hand out of my pocket and raised it for the entire room to see. Resting in the center of my calloused palm were the muddy, broken remains of the small oak box I had spent 3 full months carefully carving. The craftsmanship had been destroyed, entirely crushed under the careless heels of his wealthy guests, and soaked through in the filthy puddles of his grand driveway. But resting perfectly unharmed atop the ruined muddy wood was the single object Derek Voss desperately needed to survive, a highly specialized custom-milled titanium key. Even beneath the warm, ambient glow of the crystal chandeliers, The cold metal seemed to drink in the light, gleaming with a heavy, undeniable authority. "I found it outside in the freezing mud on my way back in," I said, keeping my voice steady and perfectly even. "I watched your groundskeepers getting ready to sweep it into the industrial incinerator. You ordered your security to throw my gift away, Derek. You called it trash. You stood right there and let your wife humiliate me. Let her kick that box aside because it wasn't wrapped in expensive designer paper. You discarded the only thing that could have saved you." Derek stared at the gleaming titanium key, his jaw trembling uncontrollably, his eyes stretched wide with a horrifying realization that tore through what was left of his fragile mind. "Do you know what this key opens?" I asked, taking one slow, deliberate step toward him. "This key belongs to a highly secure private safety deposit box sitting in a subterranean vault in downtown San Francisco. And inside that specific steel box is the original unaltered master trust document from exactly 5 years ago. It carries our wet ink signatures. It is the undeniable physical proof that the medical waiver you tricked me into signing last month is a malicious forgery, plain and simple. Without this key, you could have lied to the federal judges. You could have claimed the digital freeze was some terrible mistake. You could have walked away with your stolen millions and left me to rot in poverty. But with this key, the federal prosecutors have exactly the physical evidence they need to put you in a maximum security prison for the rest of your miserable life." The crushing weight of his catastrophic mistake settled squarely onto his shoulders. This brilliant, arrogant chief executive came to understand that his destruction hadn't been delivered by some sharp corporate rival or a sudden market collapse. His total ruin had been caused entirely by his own cruel, unyielding arrogance. He had literally instructed his own staff to throw his only salvation straight into the garbage. The psychological collapse was total and immediate. Derek's legs simply gave out beneath him. He pitched forward, his knees cracking hard against the imported Italian marble floor. The sound rang through the silent room. His $5,000 custom Italian tuxedo bunched around him, soaking up the wet, muddy tracks left behind by the federal agents. He had no concern for his appearance anymore. He had no concern for the wealthy socialites watching him, or the armed agents standing just feet away. He lifted his face toward me, completely contorted, raw agony written across every feature. Hot tears poured down his pale cheeks, running together with the heavy sweat across his forehead. He raised his shaking hands and pressed them together in a desperate, pitiful gesture of prayer. "Please, Leonard!" Derek sobbed hysterically, his voice splintering into a high, broken whine. "Please, I am begging you. Don't do this to me. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. I will give everything back. I will sign the company over to you this very moment. I will walk away with nothing. Just please, please give me the key. You cannot let them take me to prison. I will not survive in there. You are a good man, Leonard. You are family. Please save me." Derek's pathetic, broken pleas hung in the stagnant air of the grand foyer, bouncing off the imported Italian marble walls. He stayed on his knees, hands clasped together, tears streaming down his pale face. Not a single one of the federal agents surrounding him showed any sympathy. They had watched countless arrogant, wealthy men crumble exactly like this when the terrifying reality of federal prison finally caught up with them. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the man who had methodically dismantled my life over the past 5 years. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity, no anger, just a deep, hollow emptiness. But before I could even part my lips to answer his pathetic begging, a sudden blur of movement caught the edge of my vision. It was Celeste. My daughter had been standing to the side, frozen in a state of total shock from the moment she saw the zero balance on her banking application. But as she watched Derek groveling on the floor, weeping and frantically offering to surrender the entire corporate empire, a dark, calculating survival instinct snapped violently awake inside her. She understood with sudden absolute clarity that the ship was fully submerged and Derek was an anchor locked around her neck. Without a heartbeat of hesitation, she marched across the wet, muddy floor in her custom designer birthday gown. She stopped directly beside her sobbing husband, drew back her expensive high-heeled shoe, and drove it viciously into his ribs. Derek gasped in pain and toppled sideways onto the hard marble clutching his side. Celeste stood over him, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You disgusting monster!" she screamed, her shrill voice tearing through the heavy silence. "You lied to me? You completely destroyed my life. You told me you were a brilliant entrepreneur. You told me you built this entire company from the ground up. I cannot believe I ever married such a pathetic lying thief. You stole from my own father. You stole from my family to feed your disgusting gambling habits. I hate you. I never want to see your face again." She hurled the words with such venomous fury that even the seasoned federal agents shifted back a cautious step. It was a spectacular piece of theater, a calculated public performance designed to sever every legal and emotional tie to the drowning chief executive. She wanted the wealthy investors, the socialites, and above all the federal authorities to see her as nothing but a tragically deceived victim. Once she was satisfied, she had made her revulsion sufficiently clear, she executed a breathtaking emotional pivot. The vicious, aggressive fury evaporated from her face in an instant, replaced by an expression of profound, innocent devastation. She turned from her groaning husband and came rushing straight toward me. She paid no attention to the mud or the cold rainwater still dripping from my ruined suit. She threw herself forward, dropping to her knees directly in front of me, clutching the lapels of my cheap wine-stained jacket with both hands. Heavy, dramatic tears spilled rapidly from her wide eyes, streaming through her perfectly applied makeup. "Daddy!" she cried, her voice trembling with exquisitely manufactured sorrow. "Daddy, I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea. I swear to you on my life, I knew nothing about his debts or the blind trust. He kept everything hidden from me. He left me completely in the dark." She sobbed loudly, pressing her forehead against my wet chest, gripping my coat as though she were a terrified child, jolted awake from a nightmare. "I thought the money was lost in the market crash, just like he told you." Her words tumbled out in a frantic, breathless rush. "He controlled every bank account. He controlled every single part of our lives. He turned so abusive and manipulative. He forced me to say those terrible things to you tonight. He told me that if I didn't have you thrown out and publicly humiliate you, he would cut off my credit cards and put me out on the street. I was so frightened of him, Daddy. I only slapped you because he made me. It was all him. Please, you have to believe me. Please protect me. I am your little girl." I stood there like a statue, taking in every desperate, frantic lie. 40 years of fatherhood moved through my tired mind in a flash. I remembered cradling her as a newborn. I remembered pulling double shifts at the hot, greasy mechanic shop just to pay for her ballet lessons and her out-of-state college tuition. I remembered walking her down the aisle, believing with my whole heart I was placing my precious daughter into the care of a man who would love and protect her. For a very long time, there was nothing in this world I wouldn't have done to keep her safe. If she had come to me weeping like this even 1 month earlier, my heart would have shattered completely, and I would have moved mountains to shield her from whatever consequences were closing in. But as I looked down at her now, clinging to my ruined clothes and spinning her web of pathetic lies, my heart stayed entirely cold. The truth was right there in front of me, painful and undeniable. The sweet, innocent daughter I had loved and sacrificed everything for had been gone for a very long time. The woman sobbing at my feet was nothing more than a greedy, hollow shell, a deeply selfish parasite who cared only about her luxurious life, perfectly willing to throw her own husband into the fire the instant the money vanished. She didn't love me. She loved the enormous financial power I now held in my hands. I reached down slowly and took hold of her wrists. My grip was firm, completely stripped of any parental warmth or gentle affection. I pried her manicured hands off my wet jacket and stepped deliberately backward, severing the physical connection between us entirely. The fake tears stopped flowing on the spot. She looked up at me, her wide eyes flashing with a sudden, genuine spike of pure panic, as she grasped that her theatrical performance was doing absolutely nothing to move me. I looked down at her with complete emotional detachment, my voice landing like cracking ice in the tense, quiet room. "Are you sure about that, Celeste?" I asked, flat and cold. "And are you absolutely certain you had no idea?" Before she could desperately piece together another frantic lie to save herself, Elliot Crane stepped smoothly out of the shadows directly behind me. The powerful Wall Street billionaire didn't utter a single word. He simply reached into the inner breast pocket of his immaculate custom-tailored suit and drew out a small, sleek digital audio recorder. Elliot held the compact silver device between his thumb and forefinger, presenting it like a loaded weapon. The red recording light on top blinked steadily, a tiny, unwavering beacon of truth in a room thoroughly suffocated by lies. Celeste stared at the recorder, her perfectly manicured hands slowly falling away from the damp fabric of my jacket, her tear-streaked face twisted in sudden genuine confusion. She had moved through her entire life convinced she was the sharpest mind in any room, certain her manipulative charm could efface any terrible mistake she made. But as I took the sleek recorder from Elliot's outstretched hand, I watched every last trace of that certainty drain from her eyes. Vanguard Holdings doesn't conduct standard financial audits when they prepare to acquire a multi-million-dollar corporate empire, I said softly, looking down at my kneeling daughter. They hire former intelligence officers. They monitor private servers, intercept encrypted emails, and record cellular communications to confirm they are not purchasing a criminal enterprise. They captured hundreds of hours of your private phone calls, Celeste. I raised the device high enough for the entire room to see it clearly. The armed federal agents stood perfectly still, hands resting cautiously on their tactical belts, completely absorbed by the family drama unfolding before them. Even Derek paused his pathetic sobbing, slowly raising his heavy head from the cold marble to stare at the small silver machine. The ambient noise inside the grand foyer fell to absolute dead silence. I didn't hesitate another moment. I pressed the play button firmly on the side of the device. A brief hiss of digital static filled the room, followed immediately by the crystal-clear audio of a recorded telephone conversation. The call had been made exactly 2 days ago, and the voice that rolled through the grand acoustics of the mansion did not belong to Derek. It belonged entirely to the woman kneeling right at my feet. The arrogant, deeply impatient tone of my daughter's recorded voice cut through the tension like a sharpened blade. She sounded completely unbothered, casually discussing my fate, as though she were chatting while browsing a high-end boutique. Just make the old idiot sign the medical papers. Celeste's recorded voice sneered with a cruelty that was almost unimaginable. The venom in her tone bore no resemblance whatsoever to the weeping innocent victim she had been performing moments before. Once we get him declared incompetent and lock him away in a nursing home, we collect the 80%, and I never have to look at his ugly face again. The recording captured a short, dismissive laugh, a sound so utterly hollow, so stripped of basic human empathy, that it sent a chill driving straight down my spine. Then the intercepted call cut off abruptly. The sharp digital click of the device going silent echoed across the quiet room. The impact of her own words was immediate and total. The carefully constructed illusion of her innocence shattered into a million irreparable pieces directly in front of the federal authorities. Celeste went completely rigid, her mouth falling slightly open in pure, undisguised shock. The manufactured tears on her cheeks dried in an instant, replaced by the dawning, terrifying realization that she had just been publicly exposed as the true architect of my destruction. She had known everything from the very start. She had planned my ruin with cold, deliberate precision. She genuinely wanted me confined to a secure psychiatric facility so she could freely spend the millions I had sacrificed my entire life to build. The federal investigators exchanged grim, knowing glances. They had handled countless ruthless corporate conspirators, and Celeste had just handed them undeniable proof of her active role in a massive federal fraud. Derek looked up at his wife from his humiliating position on the cold floor. He had just watched her viciously kick him and cut him loose to save herself, only to be instantly exposed as an equal partner in the very crime she was trying to pin on him alone. The mutual contempt crackling between the two of them was a deeply pathetic thing to witness. I looked at them both, the greedy daughter and the arrogant son-in-law, utterly destroyed by their own relentless ambition and bottomless selfishness. The crushing weight of the last 5 years lifted completely from my tired shoulders. I was no longer a victim trapped in their darkness. I was the undisputed master of my own fate, once again holding every remaining card. I turned slightly and reached toward a silver tray resting on the nearby polished walnut table. One of the fleeing tech investors had left a half-full crystal glass of vintage red wine sitting abandoned behind them. I picked up the heavy glass with my left hand. In my right, I held the gleaming titanium vault key, the single physical object standing between them and a maximum security federal prison. I slowly positioned the metal key directly over the wide rim of the crystal glass. Derek let out a loud, violent gasp, thrusting his trembling hands forward in a desperate last attempt to stop me, but the armed agents immediately drove him back down against the hard floor. Without breaking my cold, steady gaze, I opened my fingers. The custom-milled titanium key dropped heavily into the dark red wine with a soft splash and sank straight to the bottom of the glass. Celeste finally found her voice, releasing a sharp, hysterical scream of pure panic, but it was far too late for apologies. I drew my arm back and hurled the dark liquid squarely into both of their terrified faces. The room watched in absolute stunned silence as the final act of vengeance played out. "Happy birthday!" The dark red wine dripped slowly down Derek's face, soaking into his crisp white shirt and running together with his tears. He let out a pathetic wail that sounded like a dying animal. The federal agents gave him no moment to wipe his face or collect himself. The lead agent stepped forward, his heavy boots striking the marble floor, grabbed Derek by the collar of his ruined custom tuxedo, and with one swift practiced motion, spun him around and drove him face first against the polished walnut table where the fraudulent $15 million contracts still lay. The sharp, unmistakable sound of heavy steel handcuffs clicking tightly around Derek's wrists rang through the grand foyer. It was the sound of absolute finality. Derek began to thrash wildly against the heavy table, shrieking about his innocence, about terrible misunderstandings about his powerful attorneys. But his frantic words landed on completely deaf ears. Two large federal agents seized him by the arms and dragged his thrashing body backward. His expensive Italian shoes scraped across the imported marble as they hauled him toward the massive front doors. He kicked and screamed, appealing to the remaining party guests for help, but the wealthy elite simply turned their faces away in disgust. They shoved him out into the violent storm and pushed him roughly into the back of a waiting armored federal transport vehicle. As Derek was taken away, another group of official-looking individuals entered through the front. These were not federal agents. They were elite representatives from the Federal Banking Commission and the primary lending institutions, flanked entirely by their own private security personnel. They moved with clinical efficiency, wholly indifferent to the lavish surroundings and the terrified socialites still scrambling to gather their things and escape. One senior bank representative walked directly to the main interior wall and drew a thick roll of red federal seizure tape from his briefcase. He began methodically applying bright, conspicuous foreclosure notices across the hand-painted wallpaper and the massive marble pillars. The $15 million estate was no longer a monument to extraordinary wealth and elite social standing. It had become an active federal crime scene, a seized government asset. The sheer speed at which Derek's entire fraudulent empire was being methodically torn apart was breathtaking to witness. Everything he had stolen, everything he had schemed and manipulated his way into acquiring, was being legally stripped from him in a matter of minutes. Celeste simply stood frozen amid the chaotic flurry of federal activity. The dark red wine I had thrown in her face was still dripping from her chin, soaking into the delicate fabric of her custom designer birthday gown. She looked around the grand foyer with wide, completely vacant eyes, unable to process the total collapse of her carefully curated reality. A female federal agent approached her with a stern, uncompromising expression. "You need to vacate the premises immediately, ma'am," the agent commanded, pointing firmly toward the open front doors. "This entire property, including all physical contents, vehicles, and personal belongings inside, has been officially seized by the United States federal government pending a major criminal investigation. You are legally trespassing." Celeste gasped, her hands flying to her stained chest in absolute horror. "You cannot do this to me," she shrieked, her voice fracturing with raw panic. "I live here. All of my clothes, my jewelry, my entire life is inside this house. You cannot simply throw me out onto the street." The federal agent did not flinch or offer the slightest sympathy. "You have 2 minutes to walk out that door on your own," the agent said, her voice flat and cold. "Or you will be placed in handcuffs and physically removed for obstructing a federal seizure operation." Celeste looked desperately toward me, her tear-filled eyes silently pleading for some last-minute rescue, but I simply turned my back on her and began walking steadily toward the front entrance. I passed through the heavy oak doors and left the chaotic strobing lights of the grand foyer entirely behind me. The freezing rain was still pouring down in thick, relentless sheets. I descended the stone steps and crossed the muddy driveway, making my way back to the midnight black Rolls-Royce Ghost, where Elliot Crane was already waiting. I climbed into the warm, luxurious cabin and sank deeply into the pristine leather seat. A few moments later, I looked out through the rain-streaked tinted window. 2 federal agents had taken my daughter by the arms and forcefully escorted her from the mansion. They pushed her down the wet stone steps and left her standing alone in the vast circular driveway. She wore nothing but her thin, soaking birthday dress. The freezing rain flattened her hair against her face and washed away her expensive makeup in dark rivulets. She wrapped her bare arms tightly around her shivering body, surrounded by crushed flowers, deep mud, and the relentless strobing glare of police cruiser lights. She was standing in the exact spot where she had thrown me away like garbage just 1 hour before. The poetic justice of that moment was completely undeniable. She looked utterly pathetic, shaking violently in the brutal cold, finally enduring the same harsh, unforgiving reality she had so casually inflicted on her own father. She slowly lifted her face through the heavy rain and found my eyes through the thick tinted glass. Her mouth opened, her voice crying out my name, begging for one final chance at forgiveness. But the time for lies and manufactured tears was entirely finished. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse. I calmly raised my right hand and pressed the silver button on the door panel. The thick glass window rolled smoothly all the way up, sealing out her desperate voice forever. As the midnight black Rolls-Royce Ghost pulled away from the heavily guarded crime scene, I leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest and closed my tired eyes. The heavy rain that had punished the city all evening was finally beginning to ease, softening to a quiet, gentle drizzle against the thick windshield. I listened to the smooth, quiet hum of the powerful engine and felt a profound, unshakable sense of peace settle deep into my weary, aging bones. Elliot Crane sat quietly across from me, giving me the space and silence I needed to absorb the full magnitude of what had just unfolded. I slowly opened my eyes and looked out the side window one final time. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal cruisers dissolved into the dark, winding roads of the exclusive Atherton Hills. I was leaving that $15 million mansion and the poisonous people inside it firmly in the rearview mirror of my life. I never looked back again, closing that dark chapter entirely and forever. The aftermath of that explosive night was swift and brutally decisive. The federal authorities dismantled Derek Voss's fraudulent real estate empire with surgical precision. Because I had successfully produced the original trust document along with the intercepted audio recordings, the prosecutors held an absolutely airtight case. Derek pleaded guilty to multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud and international money laundering, desperately hoping to shave time off his lengthy sentence. But the federal judge showed him no mercy whatsoever. He was sentenced to 20 long years in a maximum security prison, fully stripped of his expensive custom suits and his arrogant sense of invincibility. As for the dangerous Russian syndicate, he owed $10 million. The federal seizure of his assets cut off any ability to repay them. He currently sits in a small concrete cell, constantly looking over his shoulder, dreading the day he is eventually released. My daughter Celeste walked away from the wreckage with absolutely nothing to her name. Because the federal government permanently seized all assets purchased with stolen corporate funds, she was fully evicted and forcibly compelled to surrender her designer wardrobe, her luxury vehicles, and her extravagant jewelry. She attempted to reach out to me numerous times throughout the lengthy legal proceedings, sending long, tearful letters begging for financial support and somewhere safe to stay. I returned every single letter unopened. She had deliberately made her bed of lies and cruelty, and now she had to lie in it alone. I had spent my entire adult life trying to purchase her love and shield her from a difficult world. But I finally understood that the greatest thing I could possibly do for her was to let her face the full, unforgiving weight of her own selfish choices. I made no attempt to salvage Derek's corrupted company. The poison foundation it had been built upon was far too deeply compromised to recover. I allowed the federal courts to liquidate the real estate empire and let the fraudulent enterprise burn completely to the ground. Before the total collapse of the corporate structure, however, Elliot Crane and his team of brilliant Wall Street attorneys moved swiftly to protect my specific legal interests. As the legally documented defrauded primary equity holder, I had a clear claim. Vanguard Holdings successfully negotiated the clean extraction of my original investment capital before the massive federal asset forfeiture was finalized. The resulting financial settlement was an extraordinary and entirely unexpected blessing. I did not merely recover my original 500,000 through the careful legal liquidation of clean corporate assets. I walked away with my initial investment, plus compounded market interest totaling exactly 5 million in cash. It was a staggering sum, considerably more wealth than a retired mechanic from Cleveland could ever reasonably spend in a quiet lifetime. But I absolutely did not keep it to fund some lavish, extravagant existence. I had witnessed firsthand what obsessive greed and unchecked luxury could do to a fragile human soul. I refused to let that dark poison touch the final, peaceful years of my life. Instead, I returned to my quiet hometown and used the money to build a philanthropic foundation. I established a specialized grant program dedicated entirely to supporting struggling, hard-working blue-collar mechanics. We provide vital financial assistance to older tradesmen facing crushing medical bills. If you have stayed with me all the way to the end of this, I want you to know that means something to me. Not every story like this one gets to end with the truth walking back through the front door. This one did. I spent 5 years believing I had simply been unlucky. 5 years blaming myself for trusting too easily, for not reading the fine print, for being the kind of man who takes people at their word. What I eventually came to understand, and I believe God placed the right people in my path at exactly the right moment to help me see it, is that my willingness to trust was never the flaw. The flaw belonged entirely to those who weaponized it. That lesson cost me years of sleep, a daughter I thought I knew, and a version of my life I will never get back. But it also gave me something no amount of money could buy: absolute clarity about who I am and what I stand for. If these father stories have taught me anything worth passing along here, it is: never sign a document you have not read completely. Not for family, not for anyone you love, not under any pressure or deadline they invent. If someone rushes you to decide, slow down. Urgency is often the first tool a thief reaches for. Keep your own records. The paper trail you think you will never need is the only thing that will save you when the moment comes. And remember, a dad's revenge is not about anger. It is about refusing to let the people who underestimated you write the final chapter of your story. If this story moved you, leave a thought in the comments. I read everyone. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have not yet subscribed to His Hidden Revenge, now is a good time. There are more stories waiting, and every one of them matters. Thank you for being here with me. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next one.